Hello and welcome back to the advanced chess course. I hope you've had a chance to watch the first part of this course. If not, obviously just go back and do that before you get to this video. Last lesson I promised I'd talk about what it means to be a higher level player. Now, I don't just mean grade or rating, but I also mean things like being aware of strategy. Now, I would like to split the whole of chess into perhaps two main parts. Okay, now we have tactics and we have strategy. Tactics are things like pins, forks, skewers, discovered attacks, all those kind of miniature ways to attack and to win material. But I'd like to talk a little bit about strategy and what that comprises, what's that made up of. I would say there are three main parts to strategy. Number one, and probably the most important, is piece activity. So the activity and the way that your pieces move around the board is the most important aspect of strategy. Because if you have pieces that are stuck, they're irrelevant to the game, or they're not really doing a role, then that means that you're kind of playing with fewer pieces, with less power. And that's not what we want. We want to imagine, again, something like a football match, where if you have fewer players or maybe less skillful players, then you're going to struggle against a stronger team, or a team that is well coordinated. So think of like that. Maybe if you don't like football, then think of a similar kind of analogy. So activity of pieces is number one. I would also strongly consider the safety of your king, okay? And I think I notice this if I play against a stronger player than I am. I notice how well my opponent keeps their kings locked away under lock and key. Because ultimately checkmate ends the game. So it's a little bit like, again, if I use a football analogy, a bit like moving the goalposts. In chess, obviously in football you can't do that, but in chess you can. You can castle, and you can add defenders or pawns, pieces to block the king and to dispel the danger. So I think king safety is another aspect of strategy. The third thing, perhaps, slightly less important, but nonetheless something that I think is worth mentioning, and that is the pawn structure. So, for example, if we have, for example, double pawns or maybe even triple pawns, something like that, we would normally consider this to be a disadvantage, because double pawns that are placed in front of each other, cannot defend each other, which means that if they're attacked, they require another piece to hook onto them to defend them. But that piece that we use to defend the pawns could perhaps be used in a better way, perhaps to attack or perhaps to cover our king, for example. Yeah. So we also, you might hear me talk about pawn islands. Now, pawn islands, you can probably guess what they might be if you've not heard of the phrase already. But basically, the player with the fewer groups of pawns, so pawns that can defend each other in a big island, the player with the fewer of these islands normally is better placed, because it's harder to defend more islands. If you imagine it again like some kind of strategy game or computer game or something, you've got to take up more energy, more force to defend lots of different things at the same time. So often a strong player will be able to perhaps create a weakness that will force the opponent to defend this weakness, and then they will be able to create a second weakness, which means that the enemy forces are kind of pushed apart or tied up in some way. So those three things, just to repeat: activity of pieces, king safety, and pawn structure. Those are all strategic elements, okay? There's something else which I might mention at the end or next lesson, but I'll come to that later. I want to share my screen now, because you may remember last lesson we came on to this puzzle. Now, what we'll do is we'll continue from this point. again, if you haven't seen this position or you don't recognize it, then chances are that you haven't watched the first video. So my question was, how can white make progress in this position? We've tried already moving the king side to side, but the black king can just essentially copy and block. Black has the opposition, black is opposite. So it means that white can't really make progress with the king just yet. And similarly, this rook is, well, it's more aggressive than black's rook, but it's not making any progress here. So hopefully you've had a chance to consider the what you would do in this position. I'm going to give a clue, first of all, in case you haven't really got the right idea. I think it's important for this rook to somehow get around the back of black's position, because that means that we can attack these pawns and the king potentially from the back. Pawns, notice, can't defend backwards. They can only be defended when they're in front of another pawn, so diagonally in front, or again protected. So if we can get the rook round onto this back rank here, then we would be in a strong position. So the question is, how do we get the rook onto this back rank? Pause the video. We can do something called a Zwischenschach. I don't know if I mentioned that, but you may have had a Zwischenzug. It's called an in-between move. The Zwischenschach is, again, German. It means an in-between check. So we can throw in a check to gain a move. And the way to do this is to go rook to e5. Notice we probably could attack this pawn if we wanted, but again, black would use the rook to defend the pawn like this. So it's not it's a threat, but it's not a serious threat. We can do that probably soon. So if black goes this way, chances are we can just, again, we can use the rook to attack now. Okay, black will defend, and then perhaps white can attack this pawn. Again, black will defend. But notice now the black king is here, our king is here. We can move across to attack this pawn. It's again that rule of two weaknesses. This is weakness number one. This is weakness number two. It's going to be very hard for black to defend both. Okay, so that means that if black goes here, he's most likely going to concede a pawn. So he goes here. So how do we get this rook to the back rank? Well, that's nice and easy for you guys. It's going to be like this: rook to e8. So I'll just quickly show you the conclusion of this game. So after rook to e8, black tries some counterplay, trying to reduce the number of pieces on the board. Maybe black can manage to get a draw in a rook endgame. That is possible. Even if you've been defending, if you're a pawn down, you may be able to hang on. There's many ways to draw rook endgames, and it's very complicated, but I won't go into them at the moment. So this move here. Now, instead of just taking, I mean, white could legitimately just take this pawn. There's actually a much better move here. Again, we're looking for a Zwischenschach, an in-between check. I probably don't need to pause the video in this case because we know what that is. So we do this. So if, I guess if perhaps the king goes to here to, again, try to cut off the rook, then we can just swing this rook across behind that pawn, and basically we'll win this pawn and most likely win the game very quickly. So black can't really go here. And the same reason in this situation, black would suffer from putting the king on the same line or the same rank as the black rook, because it would block the rook from getting across. So again, black, again, he could go here, could go across, but then white would win the pawn. So there's only one other option, king c6. And now we can use tactics. We can use a skewer. See if you can work out what I'm referring to. Again, pause the video if you need to. I suspect you'll be able to see it. So we have, again, a check. and we do a skewer. So this means that, well, black loses the pawn. I'm just going to conclude this game now. You'll see that it ends very, very quickly. There's a very nice comment here. Well, black decides to defend this pawn. Otherwise, white will swing round again up here. And it says, in the book, it says that the rook has changed its parking space, but the new one is as unattractive as the previous. So basically, this square is no good either. It's very, very passive compared to that one. So again, black is a pawn down with a horribly passive rook, and also his king is shunted to one side. This king here, well, we'll see exactly what happens now. So after rook h7, we're going to get this rook to a more active post for a start. Then after that, king c6, and the king simply comes in here. So king f5. Oh, sorry, not just yet. So rook here first. Then we have the king. Again, the king could go there, but we're going to lose the pawn. So the king has to defend the pawn here. Again, a weakness. It's a weak pawn. It's on its own. And now the king just marches in. And I'm just about to play the final move. We could do this move. That would probably be just as good. But white realizes that by swapping rooks, he'll be able to win the game. Now, you would need to calculate this. As a higher level player, before you play that move, you would need to calculate what would happen, okay? So who would get a queen first in this game? Who would manage to get one of their pawns at the end first? Pause the video, and I'll play it through in a sec. So let's check it out. If black doesn't take, then he loses the pawn. So if he takes, okay, well, black can't come back across here to defend this pawn. It will take far too long. So the only legitimate way to stay in the game or to win the game is to go after white's pawns and then promote this pawn in a second. So let's just count. If you need to, you can count. That's a good way of doing it. So first of all, count the number of moves it takes white to promote the pawn, and then count the number of moves it takes black to promote. And then that's an easy way of working out who's going to promote first. Chess is a lot about counting, thinking about attackers and defenders. And also, I would say, you just need to, stuff like material, lots of numbers. And counting is, surprisingly important in chess. So as long as you can count to 5 or 10, which I'm sure you all can, then that's enough. So let's just see what happens. So black's move, white's move, black's move, white's move, black's move, white's move. Now again, we can calculate here. Black is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 away from promoting, and white is 3. Okay, so black, white, black, white, black, white, and then probably the best move that white can do now is to swing the queen all the way back, and there's no way that black can promote. Meanwhile, we push that pawn to the end to get a second queen. So that is the way to, I suppose, calculate an endgame situation. It's a question of swapping or not swapping here, okay? So that's important to remember. We can calculate that just by counting, and I'm sure all of you can do that. I think there's perhaps one more thing I want to show you just before we finish. I know that was quite a long endgame study, but I think it's one of the best studies you'll see in chess. It's quite a famous study, and I think it's really worth perhaps going over that again in my video, just to perhaps rehearse that. One more thing, and it's a game that I played. Now, try to avoid looking on the right-hand side because you'll see the moves, but I wanted to show you a position I played as white against a student. This is very recently. My excuse for not winning this game is that I was playing quickly and I was teaching, but nonetheless, my student did extremely well to pull this position back. Again, pause the video to assess material. Well, we can see that the big pieces are level, so we just need to count the pawns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so really, black is in a bit of trouble because he's not only he's a pawn down, but he's also got this queen not particularly active and this very dangerous pass pawn for white. So if white can get that to the end, then that will be game over, or even if he can swap it for a bishop. Now, at the time, I think I played moves that perhaps weren't the strongest. So I'm not going to pretend this is the perfect game at all. I'm just going to show you what happened in the game, okay? Try and guess the moves. Pause after each white move to see if you can work out what black played. Bear in mind, in order to change the course of a game, we have to play actively, okay? I'm going to show you perhaps the first couple of moves, and then again, we'll set this kind of as like a homework task, and then you can work out your strategy from then on, okay? So try and work out what the first move is. This one is just, I would say, a tactical idea, okay? So pause the video. Okay, so this is what happens. It looks like a pawn sacrifice, but, well, if white takes, then he will undefend his bishop. I will simply take the bishop, or black will simply take the bishop. I was playing white in this, so I'm white and my opponent was black. But I thought, well, how about if I exchange queens? I'm a pawn ahead, and that pawn there is extremely dangerous, so chances are I'm going to win this game if there's fewer pieces on the board, less that can go wrong. Of course, black does not allow that to happen. Now you'll see in a second what strategy is used. I perhaps could have just taken this pawn, but then I would have lost the key pawn in the center, so I had to move it up. Now, two options. Do we sit with the queen on d7 and defend passively, like black did in the endgame? Or do we play actively, try and get our queen attacking? Well, I think we know the answer to that. So the next move here is queen out. Now, I'm not saying that these moves are completely accurate. Now, if you look on, say, an analysis engine, some kind of computer, it may well tell you that these moves are not the best. But that doesn't matter. What matters is the overall feel of the game. And I mentioned earlier that I would come back to this at the end. It's very important in chess to have fight and not to give up too early. You must try to use as many resources as you can to pull yourself back in the game. And if you can keep the queens on the board, if you're losing, then that is really important. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to play that last move. I'm going to ask you guys to see if you can come up with a strategy for black now. So should we go back like this and protect our the pawn from coming forward, or should we try something else? That's the question. So I'll let you again pause the video. You can play this game on your board at home or something like that, and see if you can come up with a strategy. It doesn't matter if it's not completely right, but remember it's got to be an active strategy. Okay. I'm going to unshare now. So just to summarize, those three important strategical motifs, like something that you've got to bear in mind at all times. Activity of pieces, king safety, and pawn structure. Okay? And check to see if you can remember what a Zwischenschach is. And finally, remember to have fight, never to give up, and to try to use all of your pieces, such as your queen. If you're losing, the queen is the best way to change the course of the game. It's the most powerful piece. If they're swapped off, we have less chance of being able to turn the game around if we're losing. I hope that was useful, and I hope you've been enjoying this course. I will be releasing another video very soon, so stay in touch and keep a lookout for my next video. See you soon.